Hello again. This is Ted Cooley with chapter 9 and 10 of the People's History of the United States, comments and reviews thereon. Beginning with chapter 9. This long chapter covers the plight of the slave through the brief period of Civil War and Reconstruction to the reimposition of a third-class position within the beginnings of the Jim Crow laws following the 1876 election. This is a long and complicated chapter, but it serves to complete the story from slavery to tenant farmer back to a similar social and economic position as slavery. Thus, the promise of emancipation and reconstruction remained empty for many, though isolated individuals rose to prominence and influence through this. The abolitionist and feminist movements remained together in the 1850s with a large increase in activity on the Underground Railroad. The free Black involvement is emphasized by Zinn. Free Black and escaped slaves in the North were very capable spokespersons for their people. The Southern slaveholders were well aware of the increasing tension with their, quote, property. A very significant analysis, and it's top on the chart here, of the economic consequences of slavery was published in 1857. Is unfortunately overlooked by a lot of historians. Hinton Helper, a Southerner from a slaveholding family, used the 1850 federal census materials to examine the increase in prosperity in the North and in the South. This report was published in 57 and shared widely in both North and South. His conclusion stressed that the slave, cotton, debtor economy of the South was falling behind the North and destined to continue so. Enormous debt was held in New York and London banks as the fancy plantation houses and great investment of wealth in slaves who desired to run away resulted in a society constantly falling behind. The infrastructure in the South was well behind that of the North, with a gap in number and quality of railroads becoming a major weakness in the impending Civil War. The railroad rails at that time were iron, which would slowly compress under the weight of traffic. Thus, they had to be re-rolled in an ironworks to be reformed into the correct shape for usage. The only such works in the South were in New Orleans and Richmond, Virginia. Dams, roads, and other public works were also lacking. Public schools were unknown. The book of Helper caused a lot of comment and requiring his presence to be out of North Carolina. The impact on the slave was to place him in a place and time which was gradually declining in economic status, even though he was on the bottom. All of the status was dropping, which hurt the slave position even worse. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 bought a few more years of peace, other than in Kansas. There, the war started in 1855 and lasted 10 years. Southerners from Missouri came west. Northerners came from as far away as Massachusetts to try and determine whether or not Kansas would be a free state. I had two great-grandparents who arrived in Kansas in 59 and 60 as abolitionists to take part in this venture. One served in the 8th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, the second lost her first husband in combat in the 12th Kansas Volunteer Infantry. The impending war brought conflict to an area almost devoid of slaves. The war brought massive desertions of slaves from plantations, enlistment in the Union Army, great movement of peoples, and freedom through the South. Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, was occupied by the Union Navy. Most of the land under cultivation was turned over to freed slaves early in the war, though they lost a lot of this after the war was over. They did an outstanding job of crop management, to the amazement of the officers stationed there. Black Union troops were recruited first in Boston, then from just freed slaves. The white enlisted resented this at first, only to change their minds when they realized that the black could stop a bullet just as well as a white. The thought of black soldiers armed and in Union blue was the worst nightmare of the Southern citizen. Some Union officers never felt comfortable with this, though it was official policy from 1863 on. Following the war, the Freedmen's Bureau was established to make sure that the slaves remained free. Many programs were instituted, such as banning Confederate officer veterans from voting or holding office, while insisting on giving the blacks the right to vote. Howard University in DC, which today is still putting people in very public places with its high quality education, was founded with General Howard establishing a school of higher education, especially for the freed slaves. A great deal of plantation land was split up and provided, along with the mule and farming implements, for those who had worked the plantation and continued to live on it. Reconstruction has remained a bitter pill in the South. In high school, I knew a man whose chief claim to fame was that his grandfather had shot and killed the last carpetbagger in Louisiana before fleeing to Texas. The resentment of some citizens in the South remains to this day. The very close election of 1876 was contested, with the eventual compromise keeping the Republican Party in the presidency, but withdrawing the federal troops which had supported Reconstruction. As the KKK and similar organizations already existed, they quickly began to establish a program of skin color-based power in the South, primarily by violence against the former slaves and any white which supported them. The churches, which had included the blacks at the back of the congregation before the war, split along racial lines with, as an activist said in my hearing in 1966, quote, "The whites kept the building and the blacks kept the Holy Spirit," unquote. Though the last black congressman survived until 1901, the de facto power was quickly denied to the common black citizen. Many who had been given land after the war lost it to unequal treatment by banks and tax agencies. The culture of separate but equal was established with no intent to make it equal. In 1959, I saw the separate drinking fountains, the separate facilities in the communities, and following a recent Supreme Court ruling, bus terminals with white and colored passengers, interstate colored passengers in one waiting room and intrastate colored passengers in another. Coming from New Mexico, this was quite a shock. This separate system developed rather quickly. In 1877 or 78, my grandfather, just entering his teens and acquiring attitudes outside the home, was socially uncomfortable with his parents, still showing their abolitionist heritage, insisting on the ex-slave farmhand living with them in southeastern Kansas to sit together with the family for the evening meal rather than take his food later and separately. The culture along the Oklahoma border was already adapting to the results of the 1876 election compromise, despite the still strong beliefs of his parents. The section of Zinn's book on Reconstruction and the reversal and rejection of a more progressive attitude towards racial and ethnic differences may be the most important part of the book, as the material is the most often ignored in the general education program within our body politic. His sections from ex-slaves and those trying to restore the past social system without outright slavery is long, developed, and a powerful tribute to those whose voices have been deliberately silenced. Chapter 10. The whole series of economic panics in the 1800s is for the most part covered in this lengthy chapter. The primary cause of these were banking implosions caused by unregulated market capitalism, showing its greatest weakness when profit was the only, and I emphasize the only, social motive. There were panics in the banking system in 1837, 1857, 1873 in this chapter, and later in 1893, 1907, 1919, and 1929. Many of these weaknesses have been solved by bank regulation coming from the New Deal. However, should these regulations be disregarded or repealed, the same weaknesses will reappear, damaging the social fabric. It is strange that again there is a personal contact with Zinn's narrative. In 1624, two Bancool cousins were sent over at the founding of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island to look after their rich cousin's very, very large land grant. Both were later killed by Indians, but the bride of one, who I believe also came over on a later trip in 1624, is an ancestor. Over 200 years later, the same Rensselaer family was still the largest landholding on the east side of the Hudson River and running at similar for family profit as patrons. The 1829 revolt on this property, this vast landholding, is the first example Zinn gives of many such violent encounters in the next 50 years. There was an agricultural revolt, similar to later work stoppages over mistreatment by a whole group of similar workers. With the development of various trades, particularly of women in the garment industry, agitation for unions increased. Zinn tends to see these events through Marxist views. However, the pressure for unions, better working conditions, and better pay clearly predate the excellent historical examination of British working conditions in the same period as defined by Marx. By the time Marx published, in fact, Parliament was already addressing and correcting many of these conditions. The United States was slower to address the situations, but has corrected most of them during the 20th century. One thing missing from this excellent presentation is the distinction between trade unions and industrial unions. The distinction was appearing in the 1800s and still influences the union movement today. The railroad industry has always had unions based on the particular work done, whereas auto, steel, coal mining have had industrial unions. The trade unions have preserved the concept of apprentice, journeyman, and master in some form, with years of training required to achieve status in the position. Women in the garment industry and in the manufacturing of shoes were some of the first to striking as unions, though usually failing early on in their objectives. The industrial union included all working for a particular firm. Thus, the trade unions are more exclusive with higher membership requirements. Coal is a prime example of industrial unions, of which the 1870 National Labor Union is one of the first examples. One of the practices which subverted the organization of unions was the company town, where the workers were paid in scrip, only redeemable at the company store. Madrid, New Mexico, was such a place into the late 1940s, with scrip being the form of payment, when my late father-in-law did some bookkeeping services for them in about 1947. Andrew Jackson seems to have started the trend of creating a popular image and flattering the common man, unquote, while the political parties were controlled by men of wealth. In response to this power from the top, women struck by themselves for the first time in 1825 as a trade union of tailorses for higher wages. In Lowell, Massachusetts, a lot of strikes there. In 1834, the women struck for better working conditions. Before the Civil War, there was a development of similar trends in the South, where bad farming practices and often a single crop economy, cotton or tobacco, depleted the soil, so that the poor farmers not only had small acreage, but also soil lacking in productivity. Zinn offers the possibility that part of the weakness of the last years of the war on the part of the South was the gradual collapse of the food production part of the agricultural economy. Interestingly enough, after the war, it required a black man to bring scientific insight to repair the productivity of the southern farm lands. A different change was taking place for the northern farmers. With the development of industrialization, the northern farm and the connecting railroads saw a great increase in food production. Cyrus McCormick's reaper changed the work of a single man in a single day from a 1/2 acre of harvest to 10 acres. Some scholars have said that this excess wheat produced and shipped to England, helping out their food supply during the Civil War, was a significant factor in keeping England from allying with the South, considering the enormous debt held by English banks against Southern planters. Not all of the advent of technology was a negative thing. One of the few items of the labor unrest in this time, which does appear in the history books, was a strike by the anthracite coal miners in Pennsylvania, as this did impact the war effort in the North. There was a major riot in New York City, which required veterans of the Union Army returning from Gettysburg to quell the violence. Zinn credits this to labor unrest, but the military draft, tensions between various immigrant groups, particularly the Irish, and the apparent stalemate of the war at that time, all these efforts enter into the picture, which makes a single diagnosis unlikely. The Irish, following the potato famine, came by the hundreds to the United States. To say that prejudice existed would be a massive understatement. The late historian Bruce Catton reports that one Irish private, when surrounded with Confederate soldiers demanding surrender and calling out, "Surrender, Yankee," responded that, and this is a paraphrase, "In 15 years in the United States, I had never been called a Yankee," and promptly surrendered his weapon. in surrender, he had found a home. There was an influence from Marx on some of the labor troubles. In St. Louis in 1877, there was a massive strike started by railroad workers, which for a time closed down the city. This event came to the attention of Marx in England as to the possibility of some of his ideas being applied in the United States. However, to my knowledge, no Marxist system of state ownership and control of production has ever been established in a country as well industrialized as the United States. Rather, success has only taken place in countries where industrialization is only starting to take place. First in Mexico in 1910, and later that decade in Russia. Finally, the Ludlow coal miners' strike in 1914, where troops turned machine guns on strikers, killing men, women, and children, finally resulted in congressional action with respect to strikers, though this will be an important chapter in further along in this course of study. Thank you very much and have a good day.